Hello, I'm Rolando, and for this discussion, I will be talking about the Catholic Church and two very big crises they faced, centuries apart, but still ones that did a lot of damage and were handled improperly according to emergency management principles. Before I continue, it's important to note that this discussion will involve subject matter involving sexual child abuse at the hands of priests, alleged and convicted priests. So I want to make sure that I mention that before I continue, in the event that someone might find this to be unsettling and not want to continue listening. To begin talking about the Reformation period in the 1500s in the Catholic Church, there was a lot of corruption. There was a lot of the lack of accountability for the Catholic leadership. At the time, the Catholic Church in England, Germany, the surrounding areas had a large hold politically and religiously throughout that entire region. So they were a monstrosity when it came to being a religion and being a political influencer. So for anyone to consider going up against them often resulted in them either being killed or excommunicated and labeled a heretic by the church. Depending on how you viewed it at the time, one could be worse than the other. So one thing the church was doing that was considered wrong by Martin Luther, who we'll discuss here shortly, was the selling of indulgences. So this goes all the way up from the Pope at the time, who was Pope Leo X, down to the cardinals, the bishops, and the priests, anyone involved in the church. Basically, the church sold get out of hell free cards. It was basically an absolvance of your sins for a price. And these were being peddled in the streets of outside in the communities, right outside of churches, like you would imagine a used car salesman was described. Basically, they even had little rhymes for how they would sell it to try and get people's attention. So a monk at the time, Martin Luther, was fed up with this. He didn't think it was right that the Catholic Church was able to abuse their power and abuse their influence like this, so he spoke up against them in the form of 95 Theses, his arguments against the church. He posted them in a place where everyone could see them, and this immediately caught the attention of the Catholic Church and their leadership. And they made a point, rather than to sit down and talk with Martin Luther, they made a point to discourage and publicly denounce his teachings and his grievances against the Catholic Church. In particular, the selling of indulgences was a big part. There were other ones, but indulgences was the biggest one. So the Catholic Church started seeking out those who were followers of Martin Luther to try and sway public opinion away from it through the use of force, very authoritarian. And eventually it caused enough, it ruffled enough feathers, so to speak, of the Catholic leadership that they called in, the Catholic Church called in Martin Luther to it was called the Diet of Worms, basically a meeting that took place in a village called Worms, and there was Catholic leadership there, and there was also the emperor, and they brought him in, and they said, "Hey man, you need to stop teaching what you're teaching," and he said, "No, I'm not going to." And they said, "Okay, well, you stand by what you say, right?" And he said, "Yes, I do." And that was basically the gist of the meeting. So at the end of it, Catholic Church is infuriated, and given their influence they had with leadership, the emperor put a hit out on him. Said, "Hey, if anybody sees them, kill them. No matter who you are, there'll be no questions asked. Kill Martin Luther." So he goes into hiding and kind of waits out all this attention that's on him. And in the meantime, he translates the Bible and from Greek into German, so everyone can read it, and basically takes advantage of the printing press and gets out the Bible for everyone to read. So his popularity grows with that, and at the same time, so does his ill standing with the church, who had at the time excommunicated him and labeled him a heretic. So from there, a few popes come and go, and finally the Catholic Church realizes, okay, this isn't going away. We need to do something about this. So they hold a council called the Council of Trent. It lasts almost 20 years, and basically what it was to do was to appease the bad or ill sentiment towards the Catholic Church and their wrongdoings. Catholic Church realized, okay, this isn't going to go away, so let's do something about it. So they talk about what to do. They address the absenteeism of the bishops who weren't living in the archdiocese. Basically said, hey, you're going to live where you're in charge of, so you can hold people accountable. Priests you can't be selling indulgences anymore. Outlaw the selling of indulgences, and made an effort to address the grievances that were against them. But with that came the understanding of, look, we've done what you said. We recognize what you're upset about. Now you need to stop with this Protestant nonsense. We're not going to put up with anyone following these teachings. If you continue to do that, well, basically we're either going to, imprison you or we're going to kill you. Simple as that. So Catholics drew a line in the sand. The Protestants did the exact same thing. We're not backing down. We stand by what we teach. At the time, the Protestantism had grown into a huge following. So this led to Inquisition and what was dubbed as the religious wars for about 90 years. There was a lot of fighting, a lot of turmoil, a lot of conflict as a result of this because there was no middle ground found. Eventually, it got to a point where the church realized that this wasn't really going anywhere. So they basically put a stop at it. They didn't recognize Protestantism. Protestantism didn't recognize Catholics, but it ended the wars. And that was how Protestantism, or Protestants and all the different offshoots of that religion respectively came to be as a result of this. But more devastatingly was the fracturing of a Christian state. Germany, it took a while for them to recover from all the war that had happened, and the surrounding areas as well. There was a lot of death and destruction, but basically as a result of this, of the Protestant Reformation, and the church's inability to respond effectively to a crisis. When you fast forward to 2002, the Boston Globe released a front page story that talks about the Catholic Church, specifically Boston Diocese, allowing priests to continue to act as priests, to serve as priests, without being held accountable for known sexual abuse towards children. And this was a huge uproar. This was basically a culminating point, rather, of decades prior of different individuals bringing up cases of sexual assault while they were children to the bishops who are responsible for their archdiocese. They're the ones who answered to the Pope. They did nothing about it. The story details, in particular, a Father Gagan, who for decades was accused of, by different children, different parents, sexually abusing young children to the age of, I think the youngest was 4 years old, and nothing happened to him. Nothing. He was not turning to the authorities. At the time, the parishes didn't have to report. They had an agreement with the local authorities. They didn't have to report this. So this wasn't reported. Rather than holding the priests accountable, by they I mean the bishops, just shuffled around the priests to different dioceses where the abuse occurred again. And when it was brought up, it was either paid off in a settlement to avoid embarrassment, among other things, or it was told to be ignored, and the priest would move to another parish, and he would abuse children again. And in particular, single mothers who had children, who he would show up and offer to take care of the kids, and instead ended up abusing them. So this makes the news via the Boston Globe, and it blows up all over. And a bunch of survivors come forward and start talking about accusations, not just in Boston, but throughout the entire U.S. and in other parts of the world. So it just so happens that the archbishops had a conference in Dallas in 2002 when after that report was released, and the entire conversation, debates, discussions of that conference revolved around, what are we going to do about this? How are we going to handle this? They came up with a plan. They came up with the agreement through much debate that we are going to report any accounts of child abuse, sexual abuse, anything, to the authorities, to allow the authorities to handle this. We're no longer going to hold this in-house. It's not our place to do this. and they basically agreed to allow law enforcement to do their jobs, where before they handled it all on their own. So this didn't happen as it wasn't as seamless a transition as it should have been, according to the agreements that bishops' conference came to. For example, in Los Angeles, the largest archdiocese in the U.S., they were trying to avoid, the archbishop there was trying to avoid releasing records of previous priest abuse, and it was agreed that all this stuff was going to be handled beforehand. So it wasn't a seamless transition. It was definitely something that still to this day there's discussions and there's news releases about how the Catholic Church is going to handle these abuses. So reading about this throughout my research, the Catholic Church in both instances was compared to the mafia and the Cosa Nostra in particular, with their ability and how they hid things, and how they, for example, the selling of indulgences, and how there was a lack of transparency as a institution who's supposed to be doing good and supposed to represent the highest good. There's in doing so, they hid behind that the priests who were accused of and convicted of abuse, and their leaders. There was a lack of accountability for the bishops. Why weren't they held accountable for allowing this abuse to occur and not reporting it? Same thing in the Reformation period in the 1500s. Why were the bishops involved in, even up to the Pope? All this is occurring, and there's so much influence that the Catholic Church has in both instances, in both crises, that it's almost like either people are turning a blind eye, or they're not willing to accept that the church would be able to stoop to that level, that these types of events and horrible atrocities would occur under the Catholic Church. I think it's important to remember that a title does not preclude someone from immoral or illegal behavior or acts, and for the Catholic Church should have learned in the Protestant Reformation that even if it's seemingly unimportant, they need to address every single accusation that comes their way, any grievance. Hindsight's always 20/20, but thinking about the Catholic Church in the Reformation period, had they sat down with Martin Luther rather than denounce his teachings and ignore what he was complaining about, and basically excommunicated him, calling him a heretic, there's the potential there could have been some common ground met. I mean, for example, Martin Luther translating the Bible for everyone to read it. The Catholic Church were involved with that process. It could have gone a lot quicker, and it also probably could have helped people forget about the selling of grievances. Say, hey, look, we understood we messed up. Here's what we're doing to fix it. We're using the money to help translate Bibles and get it out to everyone so they can have it at their own reach. It could have potentially helped change the perception of the church if they would have addressed it then. But instead they didn't. They waited, and war broke out, and there was a huge schism within the church, in the Catholic Church and Christianity. It basically fractured everything that was going. People that were following Christianity in that area. Same thing with the Boston Globe. Decades before the 2002 Boston Globe article, people knew about this happening. People as in bishops, people as in cardinals, people in power with leadership, people that had the ability to do something about it. And rather than address it, hold the priests accountable, create a public statement saying, hey, we know this happened, it's horrible, we're handling it, these people are being held accountable, we're not trying to hide anything. Basically, the whole transparency issue was put to the side. And it wasn't until it was brought to the attention of basically the global attention that anything was done about it. And at that point, it's very difficult to reel away from that, as even today, Pope Francis is dealing with this. He continues to mention, hey, we need to have open investigations. When people are reporting things, they need to be, looked into. So ultimately, for this case here, having a plan beforehand to address this, having accountability and transparency for a Catholic Church, a large organization as it is globally, to be able to understand that beforehand, I think is critical for them to avoid another future crisis just like these.